Berlin, July 19th, 1940. A sweltering Friday evening. Inside the Kroll Opera House, which was serving as the replacement for the burned-out Reichstag, the air was stifling. Massive spotlights flooded the hall with blinding light. Swastikas draped every wall, and in the front row sat the generals of the Wehrmacht. They looked as if they had just returned from a parade. Their uniforms glistened, their faces beamed, and they had reason to celebrate. In just 6 weeks, they had done the impossible. France had fallen, the Netherlands surrendered, Belgium crushed, the British Army, abandoning their tanks and artillery, had barely escaped with their lives from Dunkirk. In the center of this triumph, one man took the podium: Adolf Hitler. Sitting in the hall was the American journalist William Shirer. Later, in his diary, he would write that he expected to see a monster frothing at the mouth. He expected to hear the announcement of the invasion of Britain. He expected an order to wipe London off the face of the earth. But instead, something strange happened. Hitler spoke calmly, almost sadly. He opened his arms like a schoolteacher who doesn't understand why a student continues a fight he has already lost. "In this hour, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience," he said, "to appeal once more to reason and common sense. I see no reason why this war must go on." Think about those words. In July 1940, the most dangerous man on the planet wasn't threatening. He was offering peace. The terms were incredibly generous. Hitler demanded no colonies from Britain, no surrender of the fleet, no regime change. He asked for no reparations. He offered a deal any politician would dream of. You leave Europe to us, and we leave your empire to you. British soldiers go home to their families. The bombs stop falling. Peace returns. To an American listener, this might sound wild. But imagine for a second that today someone conquered all of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and then offered Washington, "Just don't interfere, and we won't touch California." Sounds tempting, doesn't it? In Washington, they watched this speech with horror. President Roosevelt understood what was actually happening. It was a trap. If Churchill agreed, Britain would become a Nazi vassal, and America would be left alone against a united fascist Europe. If Churchill refused, he would look like a warmongering madman who rejected the hand of peace and doomed his people to death. Hitler was sure of the answer. His generals were already packing their bags for vacation. The champagne was chilling. The whole world froze by their radios, waiting for London's reaction. The answer didn't come in a week. It didn't come in a day. It came in less than an hour. The British government didn't even bother sending an official diplomat. Instead, they released a short statement via the BBC. The announcer read it in a cold, dispassionate voice, as if reading the weather forecast. The text was simple. No. No negotiations. No meetings. No conditions. An absolute, categorical refusal. Silence fell over Berlin. Hitler was furious. He couldn't understand why the loser was acting as if he held all the aces. He didn't know that the British lion was cornered, but he had already made his choice. The world was shocked by such audacity. It seemed Britain had signed its own death warrant. But to understand why this refusal rang out so quickly and so harshly, we need to rewind the tape. Because the real battle for the fate of the world didn't happen on that hot day in Berlin. It happened 2 months earlier, in a dark, smoke-filled room in London, where Winston Churchill wasn't fighting the Germans. He was fighting his own ministers. And believe me, he was much closer to defeat than any of us are used to thinking. Let's transport ourselves back 2 months. May 1940. If you are an American, the image of Winston Churchill is carved in stone for you. He is the bulldog. He is the man who never surrenders. He is the symbol of stubbornness. But the story rarely told in schools is that in the first days of his premiership, Churchill wasn't a national symbol. He was an outcast in his own government. Imagine the board of directors of a massive corporation that is 1 second away from bankruptcy. The new CEO wants to risk all the assets and go all in. But the old, experienced directors want to sell off the company piece by piece to salvage their pensions. That is exactly what was happening in London. The situation was catastrophic. France, the main ally, was collapsing like a house of cards. The British army was pinned down on the beaches of Dunkirk. There were no tanks. There were no guns. It felt like Britain's clock was ticking its final minutes. In this atmosphere of panic, Churchill's main opponent wasn't Hitler. It was Lord Halifax. Halifax was the complete opposite of Churchill. A tall, gaunt aristocrat, the former Viceroy of India. He was calm, religious, and incredibly logical. In Washington and London, the elites adored him. If you had polled the establishment in May 40 on who should lead, 9 out of 10 would have chosen Halifax over the drunkard and adventurer Churchill. And Halifax had a plan. It was called the Italian option. The idea was simple and seductive. Mussolini, the Italian dictator, had not yet entered the war. Halifax proposed using him as a mediator. "Let's just find out what Hitler wants," he said in war cabinet meetings. "We don't have to agree, but we have a duty to ask. If we can save our independence at the cost of handing over a couple of islands in the Mediterranean or colonies in Africa, isn't that better than total annihilation?" Sounds reasonable, right? Any normal person asks the price before rejecting the deal. But Churchill saw what others didn't. He called it the slippery slope. "Once you sit at the negotiating table," he shouted, pacing the room, "you have already lost. Morale will collapse. Soldiers will stop fighting, waiting for peace. And when Hitler rolls out his demands, we won't have the strength left to say no. We will become slaves." From May 26th to May 28th, a war of nerves raged in that stuffy room on Downing Street. These were the most critical 72 hours of the 20th century. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Halifax threatened resignation. If he walked, Churchill's government would collapse, and the peacemakers would take power. Here is a detail that makes the blood run cold. While they argued, the Italian ambassador in London, Giuseppe Bastianini, was literally sitting by the telephone, waiting for a call from Halifax to begin the process of Britain's surrender. The documents were ready. The channel was open. History hung by a thread. Churchill was cornered. There were 5 men in the war cabinet. 2 were for negotiations. 2 were against. The 5th vote belonged to former Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the man who signed the Munich Agreement. It seemed certain he would support peace. But Churchill made a brilliant move. He gathered not just the inner cabinet, but all the ministers, 25 men, and delivered a speech that saved the world. He didn't speak of strategy. He spoke of honor. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. He won. Chamberlain swung to his side. Halifax fell silent. The Italian ambassador never got that call. Churchill held the helm, but when the adrenaline faded, he was left alone with reality. He had just rejected a reasonable peace. He had no army. They had left all their weapons in France. He was running out of money. All he had was the conviction that one cannot negotiate with Hitler, and the hope that on the other side of the Atlantic, President Roosevelt would pick up the phone. But why was Churchill so certain that Hitler was absolute evil, with whom one cannot speak? After all, Hitler, as we recall, loved Britain. To understand this obsession, we need to look inside the Führer's head. Because what Hitler offered looked like salvation on paper. But in reality, it was the most sophisticated trap in history. Here, we approach the strangest paradox of this war. If you ask the average American what Hitler wanted, they will answer, to conquer the whole world. But that's not entirely true. When it came to Britain, Hitler was not a conqueror. He was a spurned lover. It sounds insane, but Hitler was an Anglophile. In his book Mein Kampf, he wrote with admiration about how a tiny island managed to subjugate a quarter of the globe. For him, the British Empire was proof of Aryan superiority. He didn't want to destroy the empire. He wanted to build his own, in the East, in Russia, modeled after the British one. In his twisted mind, Germans and Englishmen were natural allies, the sea wolf and the land wolf. Together, they could rule the world forever. That is why his peace offer sounded so sincere. October 1939. Poland is conquered. Hitler addresses London. Why fight over some Poland? Leave it to me, and we are friends. July 1940. France is conquered. Hitler speaks again. I demand nothing. Just recognize my control over Europe. Many in the British elite nodded along. He is a gentleman, they thought. He respects us. Winston Churchill was the only one looking at this through the lens of the streets, not diplomatic salons. For an American audience, the easiest way to explain this is with a single metaphor. Churchill didn't see Hitler as a chancellor. He saw him as Al Capone. Imagine a gangster conquers the entire neighborhood, burns down a few houses, kills the shop owners, and then comes to you, the last remaining businessman, and says, "Listen, I won't burn your shop. I'll even let you keep the sign. Just buy your goods only from me, and don't talk to the police." That is not a peace treaty. That is a protection racket. Churchill understood the mechanics of dictatorship better than anyone. He knew, the moment Britain signs peace, she becomes an accomplice. First, morally. You cannot shake the hand of a man building concentration camps and call yourself a free nation. Second, economically. If Germany controls all of Europe, all the ports, all the factories, all the resources, Britain ends up in an economic stranglehold. London would become merely a junior partner, a tourist island for German officers on leave. A crocodile hoping to be eaten last. That is how Churchill described those who wanted to negotiate. He knew that any agreement with Hitler was worth less than the paper it was written on. Today, he promises not to touch the fleet. Tomorrow, he demands the ships to protect Europe from the Bolsheviks. The day after tomorrow, he installs his Gauleiter in London. It was simple arithmetic. As long as Britain fights, Hitler burns resources. The moment Britain surrenders, Hitler gains access to the shipyards, the resources of the empire, and most importantly, total quiet on the Western Front. Churchill's refusal wasn't an act of mad bravery. It was a cold, cynical calculation. He understood. It is better to be bankrupt in a free country than a wealthy vassal in a Nazi European Union. But this calculation had one problem. To be bankrupt means you need money. A lot of money. And guns. Churchill turned his head to the west. There, across the ocean, slept a massive, wealthy, but war-averse America. And Churchill decided to play the riskiest game of his life. He decided to sell off the remnants of Britain's greatness to buy American Lend-Lease. Many think the U.S. helped Britain out of the kindness of its heart. Oh no. Roosevelt was a predator, no less than Hitler. Just his methods were different. And now, you will learn the true price of this alliance. In American history textbooks, the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill is often painted in rosy colors. A great friendship. The special relationship. Two leaders standing together in defense of freedom. That is a beautiful lie. In reality, in the summer of 1940, what was happening between London and Washington looked more like a hard-nosed negotiation in a pawn shop than a meeting of friends. Churchill came to Roosevelt not as a partner. He came as a man pawning the family silver to buy bullets. Churchill made a bet that defined the fate of the world for 100 years. He decided, if the British Empire is destined to die, it is better she dies in the arms of America than under the boot of Germany. But America wasn't rushing to embrace him. Franklin Roosevelt was a brilliant politician. In 1940, he had an election coming up. American voters categorically did not want war. They remembered World War I and said, "Let the Europeans clean up their own mess." Roosevelt read the room, but he was also a cold strategist. He understood that if the British fleet fell to Hitler, America would be in the crosshairs. So he decided to help, but he sent a bill. Look at the Destroyers for Bases deal. It is a classic example of geopolitical robbery. Churchill begged for 50 old destroyers from World War I. These were rusting buckets that the U.S. Navy didn't need. They were literally rotting in the docks. What did Roosevelt ask in return? Oh, mere trifles. Just a 99-year lease on almost all strategically important British bases in the Western Hemisphere. The Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, Newfoundland. Think about the scale of this. For 50 old ships, Britain handed America the keys to the Atlantic Ocean. Effectively, in that moment, Britain ceased to be a global superpower, and the U.S. took her place. Churchill knew what he was doing. He wrote letters to Roosevelt full of flattery and drama, signing them "former naval person." But in the cabinet room, he ground his teeth. He understood that Roosevelt was methodically stripping Britain bare. Beyond the bases, there was the gold. Britain paid for every rifle, every shell in cash. Operation Fish, the secret transfer of British gold reserves to Canada and the U.S., emptied London's treasury. By the end of 1940, Britain was bankrupt. Roosevelt literally waited until the British ran out of their last dollars before offering Lend-Lease, a program where weapons were finally given on credit. It was a cynical, brutal business. But for Churchill, it was the only hope. His reasoning was, Hitler offers us life in a golden cage. Roosevelt takes our gold, but leaves the cage door open. Churchill believed in the power of American industry. He knew that if the U.S. entered the war, Germany was doomed. It was simple math. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh could produce more tanks in a week than the Reich could in a month. Churchill's task was singular: hold the line, survive the bombs, sell everything they had, but last until the American giant woke up. He stalled for time. He bluffed. He traded sovereignty. But Hitler wasn't an idiot. He saw this game. He understood that time was working against him. If he didn't end the war with Britain now, it would be too late. And at that moment, when the tension reached its peak, when German bombers were warming up their engines for the raid on London, news came from Germany that made Churchill, Roosevelt, and Hitler himself drop their jaws in disbelief. Something happened that, even today, 80 years later, sounds like the script of a bad spy movie. But it was reality. The third and final peace offer didn't come over the radio. It flew in on a fighter plane and parachuted right onto the head of an unsuspecting Scottish farmer. May 1941, Scotland, night. A farmer named David McLean was finishing his work when he heard the roar of engines. Low over the ground, a heavy Messerschmitt 110 fighter screamed past. A second later, the canopy opened, and a white parachute blossomed in the sky. The plane crashed into the earth and exploded. The farmer grabbed a pitchfork and ran to the pilot's landing spot. Before him stood a man in a Luftwaffe flight suit, nursing an ankle injured in the impact. In broken English, he said, "My name is Alfred Horn. I want to see the Duke of Hamilton." It soon became clear that this man was not Alfred Horn. His real name was Rudolf Hess. For an American audience to understand the magnitude of this event, imagine that, at the height of the Cold War, the Vice President of the United States gets into a fighter jet, flies to Moscow, parachutes into Red Square, and demands a meeting with Khrushchev. Rudolf Hess was the Deputy Führer, the number 3 man in the Reich, the very man Hitler dictated Mein Kampf to in prison. And here he was, on enemy territory, unarmed. Why? Official history has long called him insane, but documents suggest otherwise. Hess wasn't a traitor. He was Hitler's most loyal fanatic, and he flew on a mission. Hess knew a secret that could change the course of history. He knew that in 1 month, in June 1941, Germany would launch Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hess was no fool. Like Hitler, he remembered the lessons of World War I. A war on two fronts is death for Germany. He decided to perform a miracle. He thought the peace party was still strong in Britain, those same aristocrats like Lord Halifax who wanted to make a deal a year ago. Hess's plan was simple. He lands, finds influential Britons, concludes peace, topples the warmonger Churchill, and Germany and Britain go on a crusade against communism together. In his pocket were drafts of a peace treaty. The terms were even more generous than before. Germany leaves Western Europe. Britain gets total freedom of action. The only condition, let us deal with Stalin. The reaction to this flight was a comedy of errors. In Berlin, Hitler fell into a genuine panic. He was terrified that Churchill would use Hess to tell Stalin about the impending attack. Hitler immediately declared Hess a madman who had fallen victim to hallucinations. And what of Churchill? When he was informed that Hitler's deputy had landed in Scotland, the Prime Minister was watching a Marx Brothers comedy. He didn't even look away from the screen. "Hess or no Hess," he grumbled, "I'm going to watch the Marx Brothers." For Churchill, it no longer mattered. He knew the point of no return had passed. He ordered Hess locked in the Tower of London and treated as a high-ranking POW. No negotiations, no meetings. Hess sat in prison for the rest of his life, never understanding one thing. Britain in 1941 was not the same country as in 1939. The bombing of London had killed the peace party. Hatred of the Nazis had become the nation's fuel. Hess's flight was the last, desperate knock at the door before true hell began. The door did not open. 40 days later, Germany attacked the USSR, opening the second front that would destroy it. But let's pause for a second. Let's imagine Hess's plan had worked, or that a year earlier, Churchill had lost the argument in the cabinet. What if Britain had said yes? We are entering nightmare territory. Historians and military analysts have modeled this scenario, and what they saw makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. The world we live in today hung by a thread, and here is what it could have looked like. Let's close our eyes for a moment and imagine that Lord Halifax won that argument in May 1940, or that Churchill accepted Hitler's offer in July. What would that world look like? You don't need to be a science fiction writer to see it. It is enough to look at the documents that were already sitting in safes in Berlin and London. First, silence. The air raid sirens in London go quiet. British soldiers return home. There are celebratory parades in the streets. "Peace with honor," scream the newspaper headlines. Churchill resigns, booed out of office as a warmonger. But then, the slow strangulation begins. Britain becomes a neutral country, like Sweden or Switzerland. But neutral is a polite word. In reality, she becomes an economic vassal. German goods flood the market. British factories begin working for the German war machine. The scariest part happens quietly. At Berlin's demand, London begins to extradite fugitives. Thousands of German Jews, political dissidents, Polish officers who found refuge in England are sent back to the continent, to the camps. Democracy in Britain begins to die, giving way to a friendly regime. Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British fascists, is released from prison and becomes a key political figure. Now, look at the map. This is what should terrify any American. Without Britain as an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, the U.S. has no staging ground. D-Day? Impossible. You cannot ferry an army across the Atlantic and land it directly on the beaches if you have no base to prepare. America finds itself in total isolation. This is the concept of Fortress America. Roosevelt likely loses the 1940 election. Isolationists say, look, Europe made a deal. Why should we spend billions on the army? The U.S. remains with a tiny military and the Great Depression, which hasn't gone anywhere because there are no war orders. Meanwhile, in the East, a catastrophe unfolds. June 1941. Hitler attacks the USSR. But now he has one giant advantage. He doesn't need to keep 1 million soldiers in France and Norway waiting for a British strike. He doesn't need to waste thousands of fighters defending German cities because the British Air Force isn't bombing Berlin. The full might of the Luftwaffe, the full might of the Wehrmacht crashes down on Moscow. German industry, untouched by bombing, runs at 100% efficiency. Without British convoys to Murmansk, without American Lend-Lease, which went through British channels, the Soviet Union likely collapses by 1942. Hitler gets the resources of the Urals, the oil of the Caucasus, and the grain of Ukraine. And here we reach the point of no return, the moment that will give you chills. Many Americans are sure the U.S. created the atomic bomb. That is true. But few remember the program started in Britain under the code name Tube Alloys. It was the British who handed over critically important calculations and technology to the Americans in 1940 to 41. In our alternate scenario, this doesn't happen. Britain doesn't share secrets with the U.S., but Germany has Werner Heisenberg, and Germany has heavy water plants in Norway that no one is bombing or sabotaging, because British commandos are sitting at home. Without a two-front war, having access to all the resources of Europe and Russia, Nazi scientists get unlimited funding. By 1945 or 1946, Germany creates the atomic bomb, and they have the delivery systems. The V-2, the first ballistic missile, was created in reality. In a world without bombing, the Germans have time to develop the Amerika Rakete project, A9-A10, an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching New York. Imagine this finale. 1946, a Cold War between Nazi Europe and an isolated America. And one morning, a mushroom cloud rises over Manhattan or Washington. The U.S. is forced to capitulate. The world plunges into the darkness of the 1,000-year Reich. This isn't fiction. This was a real path history could have taken. The only obstacle on this path was the word no, spoken by one stubborn old man in 1940. Churchill bought us this world. He paid for it with the British Empire. But at the end of 1941, it seemed that even his stubbornness wasn't enough. Britain was running on fumes. Hitler was at the gates of Moscow. And then, an event occurred that Churchill had waited 1.5 years for. The event that turned a European war into a world war. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy went into radio silence. The giant was waking up, and he was furious. Sunday, December 7th, 1941. For most Americans, this is a date which will live in infamy. A day of fire, smoke, and tragedy at Pearl Harbor. A day when 2,400 American boys died. But let's transport ourselves 6,000 miles east, to the country estate of Chequers, where Winston Churchill was having dinner. For him, this wasn't a day of infamy. For him, it was the day God answered his prayers. The evening was dreary. Churchill sat at the table with American Ambassador John Winant and Roosevelt's envoy, Averell Harriman. The mood was grim. The news from the fronts was terrible. The Germans were near Moscow. In North Africa, the British were retreating. Darkness seemed to be closing in. At 9 p.m., the butler brought in a small portable radio. The BBC announcer started the news with something indistinct, but then came the phrase, "The Japanese have attacked American shipping at Hawaii." Churchill froze. He didn't believe his ears. He jumped up from the table and ran to the telephone to call Washington. Imagine this conversation. On one end of the line, the British Prime Minister, breathless with excitement. on the other, the President of the United States. "Mr. President, what's this about Japan?" Churchill asked. Roosevelt replied, his voice full of fatigue. "It's quite true. They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." In his memoirs, Churchill would write words that might shock a modern reader with their honesty. He doesn't write about grief. He doesn't write about sympathy. He writes, "So we had won after all." That night, while America was in panic and the world mourned the dead, Winston Churchill went to bed and, in his own words, slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. Does it sound cynical? Perhaps. But look at it through his eyes. Since May 1940, he had carried an unbearable weight on his shoulders. He knew Britain could not defeat Germany alone. It was physically impossible. For a year and a half, he bluffed, bargained, begged, and stalled, waiting for only one thing: for America to enter the war. And now it had happened. Churchill knew the simple arithmetic of war. Japan is a problem, yes, but U.S. resources are limitless. "America is like a gigantic boiler," he said. "Once the fire is lit under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate." 4 days later, on December 11th, Hitler made his most fatal mistake. Instead of letting the U.S. focus on Japan, he declared war on America himself. For Churchill, this was the finale of his gamble. He bet everything on red, on America. And the roulette ball landed on red. The bet paid off. The British Empire was saved from annihilation. Nazism was doomed. It was only a matter of time and blood. But in this moment of triumph, Churchill did not yet realize one important detail. The second America entered the war, Britain ceased to be the main player. The savior had arrived. But salvation had a price. Churchill thought he had invited a partner. In reality, he had invited a boss. The war would end in victory. There was no longer any doubt. But the world that would emerge from the ruins of this war would be nothing like the old British lion imagined. The empire survived only to die. Look at the famous photograph from the Yalta Conference in 1945. 3 leaders sitting side by side: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. At first glance, it is a photo of victors. But if you look closer, you see a tragedy. Roosevelt is dying. His days are numbered. Stalin looks like the master of the situation, controlling half of Europe. And Churchill? Churchill looks small, tired. By 1945, he realized the bitter truth. Britain had won the war, but lost the peace. The price of victory turned out to be unbearable. To pay for American weapons, Britain liquidated its overseas assets. To get destroyers, she gave away her bases. To survive, she dismantled the economic system that had allowed her to rule the waves for 200 years. After the war, America didn't forgive the debts. Washington politely but firmly asked for the money back. Britain transferred the final Lend-Lease payment to the U.S. and Canada only in 2006. Think about that. In the 21st century, British taxpayers were still paying for Churchill's decision not to surrender in 1940. Irony of fate. Hitler offered to preserve the British Empire. Churchill refused, and the empire vanished. Within 10 years of the war, India, Africa, Asia, they all left. The Union Jack was lowered from flagpoles all over the world. America took Britain's place. Pax Britannica died. Long live Pax Americana. Many historians ask the question, did Churchill make a mistake? Was he the gambler who blew his children's inheritance in a single night? If you look at it like an accountant, yes, it was a failure. But history is not accounting. Imagine the alternative for a second. Imagine a world where Churchill said, yes, Britain would be rich, London would be intact, the empire would exist, but it would be a world where the swastika flies over Europe, a world where the fires in the ovens of Auschwitz continued to burn, a world where America remained an isolated island surrounded by enemies, and perhaps eventually, would have fallen. Churchill made a choice available only to the great. He decided to burn down his own house to stop a fire that threatened to destroy the entire village. He sacrificed the British Empire for Western civilization. He passed the torch of leadership to America, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way to preserve freedom. The world you, the American viewers, live in today, a world of global trade, democracy, NATO, that world was purchased at the price of Britain's bankruptcy. On July 19, 1940, Hitler waited for an answer. He was sure logic was on his side. But Churchill didn't answer with logic. He answered with character. Sometimes, to win the most important battle in history, you have to be willing to lose everything except your honor. Winston Churchill lost the empire, but he saved the soul of humanity. And perhaps that was the best deal in history.